I'd like to welcome Flavio Volpe, President of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association, which represents original equipment suppliers to the global auto industry. Flavio worked closely with officials in Canada, US, and Mexico during the 2017-2019 NAFTA renegotiations, which led to USMCA, or as we call up here, CUSMA. He was named as one of the top 50 people influencing Canadian foreign policy by the Hills Times. Flavio is regularly interviewed about the auto industry by the media in Canada and the United States. Welcome to the show, Flavio Volpe. Thanks for
Thanks
being
for
with
having
us.
me, Allan. Thank you.
So great to have you at this time. Obviously, a lot of news coming to all of us as of late. But I thought I'd start off with just a general question, get your take on the auto industry. What would you say the current state of the auto industry in Canada is? We hear a lot of negatives. We hear recently perhaps some positives to come. But what would you say your take on the auto industry? How is it performing and where do you see it
Sure.
going forward?
Sure, it's an anxious time. It's underperforming against capacity. There's a lot of talk out there with numbers, and one that sticks out is, look, this year or last year we made 1.3 million cars, and that's down by, about a million cars 5, 6 years ago. And there's a lot to unpack there. Most of that is the White House. Most of that is this trade war we didn't ask for. Most of that is American cars, cars that go to the US are costing consumers there an extra 25%. And it affects how we plan production here. Some of the rest of it is we all planned over the course of the last few years to electrify those programs. And it's because Americans wanted it, American regulators wanted it, and we all supported it, meaning the jurisdictions, provincial, state level, and the two federal levels. And so there's a bunch of capacity in the U.S. automakers plants here in Canada that we're retooling. And then Donald Trump has forced them to retool the retool. And so there's a lot of bounce back built in there. But that's no consolation for people who are worried about their jobs or suppliers who are worried about their contracts.
We hear a lot about obviously President Trump wanting the auto production back, coming back to the United States, and we're hearing rumblings of different companies, opening up plants or reopening plants, etc. But what about auto parts, right? We know auto production to go back to the United States, but what about the auto parts? If the president's, does he want auto parts to be produced in the U.S. as well as the automobiles themselves? And what percentage of auto parts that we produce here in Canada actually goes to the United States?
A lot of questions in one. I'll go to the central premise, which is a little goofy, that the president wants something repatriated. Well, you can't repatriate something that's been built together over 120 years. When Ford was a one-year-old startup, their first venture outside of Detroit was just across the river in Windsor to make 112 Model A's that year because there were tariff barriers and they wanted to sell to Commonwealth countries. And when General Motors was finding its first few steps, they partnered with Sam McLaughlin out in Oshawa in 1908. And in 1915, they started making Chevrolets there and built General Motors together. And the Dodge brothers sold bicycles in Windsor, put some money together and founded Chrysler, set up a plant in Windsor 100 years ago. So we've done it together. I always push back on that premise from the president and people like Howard Lutnick. You're not repatriating if we co-own it. Auto parts is very interesting. About half of the output from Canadian factories, so about half of the $35 billion worth of parts a year, go directly into the U.S., into U.S. vehicle assembly. And last year, when they said, you know what, to repatriate something, we're going to tariff everything. And we said, look, if you tariff auto parts, you're going to shut down the industry across North America. You're going to shut down the US plants. You're going to shut down Mexican plants. You're going to shut down plants in Canada and Mexico owned by US automakers. And we made that argument with the data that said, if you did that, on day one, there'd be a $75 million bill that has to be paid by automakers. And while they figure out how to get that money, day two is another 75, and day three is another 75. We convinced the White House, without having to trade anything in return, to give an exemption to auto parts within the North American region that are CUSMA or USMCA compliant. There's no tariff on them. That's what's kept the industry open. And so now, as we roll into a year that's where we're supposed to do a review, and some call it a renegotiation. Legally, it isn't. In practical terms, it is, of the USMCA. The president musing in the last few days, well, maybe we pull out, maybe we stay in, like he did in 2018. We know that Ford had a $19 billion write-down. Stellantis had a $26 billion write-down. General Motors, $6 billion, and saying they're accumulating billions as the months go on. My bet is that this year we'll see maybe new tighter rules of origin. What does it mean to qualify? You need more American content, more raw materials. But if they permanently cut off the Canadian auto manufacturing market and the Mexican one, they're likely to bankrupt one of the Detroit three, and really, really hurt automotive manufacturing in the US. And maybe they'll hurt it less than Canada. It's not a good plan.
Not a good plan at all. And
Yeah.
just last night, I think Ford announced how much money they lost due to tariffs. So it was a pretty large number.
Yeah.
And we hear all the time that auto parts can cross the border several times before it actually goes into a car itself. And so I guess you kind of alluded to it already. How important are these CUSMA, USMCA negotiations going to be over the next few months? And how many jobs could be affected by the outcome?
Look, in Canada, direct jobs, 125,000 either make cars or parts or tools. But there's about 500,000 indirect jobs. You could be in professional services, but all of your clientele is in automotive manufacturing, or you could be in logistics, and all of, or the majority of your clientele is in moving auto parts and cars. So that's the 500,000. In the US, the direct employment is about 950,000 in parts, 150,000 in cars, and probably another 3 or 4 million. Now, and in Mexico, by the way, the parts number is about 3 million. Because all of the labor-intensive parts of that value chain have been located down there because, of course, labor is cheaper. And so you have in North America about 10 million jobs that are dependent on making cars at an efficient capacity for the region. We probably make, between the three countries, we probably make 14, 15 million cars a year. But between the three countries, buy 20 million a year. It's a net import draw. So if you put tariffs on every car around the world, every single car for every single consumer in the US is going to cost more, way more than a healthy profit. There's a 25% charge the government is putting on you on these tariffs. And then within the region, the competitiveness of the product that's made in the US depends on aluminum from Quebec, steel from Hamilton, and auto parts from throughout southwestern Ontario and into Quebec. And of course, there's a very, very similar depth to the story out of Mexico. So what's really important about these USMCA negotiations is all of our hope in getting a deal to remove the national security tariffs on cars and parts, non-compliant parts, has now been rolled into the USMCA negotiations. It's a zero-sum game. But the voices in the US, dealers, automakers, parts makers, and raw material suppliers are all saying out loud and in writing to the White House, please restore that access. Because if we're going to compete with the Chinese or the Japanese and the Koreans that import, or the Europeans that import, can't do it like this.
Yeah, it's you don't realize, I guess the average person doesn't realize how large or how many people the auto
Yeah.
industry touches. And just a quick question, just something, when you think about auto parts, you think about Linamar, you think about
Yeah.
Magna, two companies. Magna has more, I guess, more facilities in the US than here. Do
Yeah.
those kind of companies, are they able to skirt by without the tariffs affecting them? Like, especially like a Magna, I guess, build whatever they need in the US for US and build whatever we need in Canada here in Canada?
Yeah, it's a good assessment of especially Magna, who's got, What people don't know is Magna is a Canadian company headquartered in Aurora with 150,000 employees around the world and 330 plants in every single country that you can name. And so they typically build for parts in those countries for those countries' needs. They have more employees in Canada than they have about a quarter of the automotive employment in Canada in their plants. Companies like Linamar that are just below that tier, but still one of the world's top 35 or 40. They're a company that in Canada makes parts for American assembly. So they've really benefited from their advocacy, really. Linda Hassenfratz was very loud. Their executive chair was said, you're going to shut the industry down in a week if you don't exempt parts. So they make stuff here, it goes there. They've been able to handle that. The smaller companies out there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 plants, who have significant business in Canada, where the other half of the production of the $35 billion worth of parts get produced in these factories every year, they go to Canadian assembly plants. And those Canadian assembly plants are really affected by the fact that 85% of what they make gets exported to the US. So their volumes are down 25, 30%. Now, if you're working in a business where the return is 6 or 7%, and your top line goes down by 25 or 30%, you are thinning out your balance sheet. You are trying to predict when your customer, when Ford in Oakville is going to reopen and sell those pickup trucks to the US, and you're hoping your bets are right because you know what it's going to cost for 6 months to hold on to people, and a year to hold on to equipment and buildings, and 2 years to just hold on to your socks. And we're going to see some real trouble by the middle of this year amongst the auto parts suppliers if we don't see that access restored.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess changing gears a little bit, federal government, as I know, just came out with a new, auto strategy, removing the EV mandates and giving rebates for purchasing electric vehicles and incentives. What do you think about the strategy? And I guess from where I sit, hearing what I do from the auto companies, getting less and less, having less EVs as a part of their business, like Ford and General Motors. Obviously, the costs involved for people to buy them and the infrastructure. But what do you think about the latest strategy by our federal government? And I guess my other question would be, why is it so tied, it seems like, to EVs? I would have thought that the auto strategy would be, obviously to keep jobs. We want to keep jobs, keep things open, keep the industry here in our country. But why is it so, it seems, tied to EVs versus all autos?
We work very closely with them on this. We hosted them. Martin Rea, one of the great Canadian auto parts suppliers, hosted the announcement in Vaughan. And if you read the fine print, there's a very important distinction between an EV mandate that said, hey, by the way, we're going to pick this technology. They're going to be battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid vehicles. This is the only technology you can use to show your progress against our target of a carbon-free economy by X, in the automotive case, 2035. And the way that we're going to judge your progress is the amount of EVs or plug-in hybrids that Canadians buy. And if they don't buy enough, i.e., if you're a car company and they didn't buy 20% of those by 2026, we're going to punish you by putting a $20,000 charge on every vehicle you fall short on. Okay. Then that number was 60% by 2030. Now the industry said, look, what's the target? Carbon? Decarbonization? Then why don't we switch from an EV mandate that picks technology to carbon targets at the tailpipe? And so there's some strong new GHG targets for 2035 and 2040 that, for people to understand, have been communicated as, well, it sounds like instead of 100% EVs by 2035, it's an equivalent of 75. But what it really means for the auto companies is, look, we're actually going to measure your carbon. So if you can make more efficient four-cylinder engines and three-cylinder engines and two-cylinder and one-stroke engines, and you want to pick EV, hybrid EV, conventional hybrid, fuel cell vehicles, we're chasing Hyundai. Hyundai says we think it's hydrogen. Well, you can use whatever mix you want. We're going to measure the carbon at your tailpipe on your fleet average, and have at it. And I think that allows the companies to pick their transition. For example, Toyota Motor Manufacturing Canada made 125,000 conventional hybrids last year, but they wouldn't have counted against the EV mandate. But they bring the overall CO2 emissions on the fleet way down. A company like Toyota shouldn't be punished because it's not going to make a market bet on EVs that people aren't buying so that it can meet some target that's arbitrary to avoid cutting a check to Tesla to buy their credits, who don't manufacture here. So it's a little complicated, and this is not how we explain to lay people. And I know we're doing this on the radio and on your broadcast, but it's not an EV target, and it doesn't require companies to make EVs, but it'll encourage them to make them as part of that mix.
Right. I guess for us, when we see all the talk about EV, when I read it, and I tried to read as much as I could, obviously, before talking with you today, why would, we even be specifying EVs? A strategy, we want to save jobs. We want to save the steel industry. We want to save, as much as we can and flourish. I would have just thought that it would be the prime minister would come up with, or whoever would come up with the idea or strategy, what we can do. Can we use our own steel? Can we, do we have to, or how do we bring foreign competition in from, or foreign, I should say, foreign car makers from other countries into Canada? Why would, and I guess I'll ask you, maybe leave off our interview on this question, why would a foreign automaker come to Canada versus the United States? What are we giving them? What incentives? What are we incentivizing them to come here? We have higher taxes. We have obviously the tariff negotiations, depending on who you talk to, going well, not going so well. There's a lot of risk, perhaps, in starting up a new plant here. What incentives could we give these foreign automakers to come here? And I guess that's what I know, talking to many people, I think that's what we were looking for in a strategy versus, a lot of the EV stuff.
Well, look, the EV stuff really kind of took the headlines, but there were 5 pieces in that strategy. The first start was do no harm. The EV mandates were going to do real harm, make the companies that employ people here and that invest here pay $3 billion to companies that don't. So relieve that pressure. But then he made some very specific tax instruments available there that reduce the effective tax rate for manufacturing of vehicles to 5% below what it costs in the US. So it'd say, okay, look, as you're forward planning, if you're in automotive, if you're in this space, we'll make that cheaper for you. Then put into place another $3 billion that was part of attracting new companies to space. I'll use Hyundai Kia, for example. It's the same company. We're all talking about it. They sell 250,000 cars to Canadians Canadians love them, but they don't manufacture here. About half of those are on the same platform. A typical auto assembly plant makes 150 to 250,000 cars. We've been pitching the Koreans to say, hey, by the way, look, you've got a business case in Canada. We're going to put some of this $3 billion available to you to develop your hydrogen technology, some of your EV technology here. Build where you sell. The other advantage here, and some of the other work that's being done by both levels of government and governments of all stripes across the country, is we have the chemistry that could populate the batteries that are the biggest, most expensive, and most valuable component of any future vehicle, completely disproportionate to engines and powertrains, where we could, if we bridge this properly, and we permit mining, and we permit synthetic manufacture in a time that people can plan. Hey, by the way, Ford, you want 2 million tons of lithium for your batteries? Well, in 2028 at this factory gate, you could pick it up at this price. Canada is positioned to be the source of all those critical minerals outside of China. So some of this is aspirational. Hey, by the way, we should stick with that EV transition because if we get to the point where we're using the stuff that's in the ground, we'll be a superpower. Okay, that's an if. Now we got to get there. So lay off this EV mandate because it's nuts. If you're going to target carbon, target carbon. If you're going to want people to drive these vehicles, put in more charging infrastructure, with which they have. By the way, make it cheaper for people to buy them, but include the hybrids. So now there's a purchase incentive also for hybrids. Now, it's not a magic bullet. And certainly the number one thing we can do, like you alluded to, is reopen the US market tariff-free so that the 500,000 units that of capacity that are dormant wake right up. But if we manage to do that, and this, and land maybe a Hyundai, and maybe launch a Canadian entity, not to make cars to compete with Toyota that makes RAV4s here, but to make the rolling stock that we need to buy as part of our NATO commitment and the 29 other NATO companies that have committed, countries that have committed to spending trillions. Then we can find a path forward for all of those people here who are really anxious, who've spent decades developing skills and see that those skills mean little when confronted with Chinese overcapacity.
You know, a lot there to chew on for sure. I think in the short term and in the long term, right? Getting up those mines, getting them up and running, and we're really presenting these foreign automakers and really countries in general that Canada is a place to grow and flourish. If you come here, we will help you build it, and I think that's a great message. Hopefully, we can get things up and running. But Flavio Volpe, President of the Automotive Parts Manufacturing Association, I want to thank you so much for being with us, taking time out of your busy day, and I guess shedding some light on what's going on with respect to the new, the new strategy, automotive strategy, as well as give us some information about auto parts, the automobile industry. A lot of people out there in Southern Ontario a little bit nervous right now, and it's great to hear from you, and look forward to having you on again, perhaps down the road.
Thanks. Let me give one last plug so that your listeners can see what Canadian auto parts companies can do and the type of innovation we have. Come to the Toronto Auto Show. We're revealing our Project Aero prototypes, two of them. One we showed with the Prime Minister last week, a little sneak peek, and one is our show of what Canadians could do for transportation in the 2040s. Project Aero, Toronto Auto Show. I guarantee you, it's going to make you think about it and make you understand a little bit more why this stuff is worth protecting and chasing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the plug there, and the auto show is always a fun time. But thank you so much once again.
Thanks, Allan.